Hello and welcome to this training series for the Maxwell to SketchUp plugin. Now, the most important thing that I can tell you about the way that the Maxwell to SketchUp plugin works is that it will work pretty much the same on every system. However, where it's located on every system is going to be a little bit different depending upon which operating system that you have and which version of SketchUp you're running. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to my SketchUp 8 install folder. You may be having this in some place completely different than I do, but mine's going to be on my C drive in my program files x86 Google SketchUp 8 folder. So you just go ahead and navigate to wherever your install folder is, and we're going to go ahead and look at something in the plugins folder. So within the plugins folder, you can find two files that you should have installed when you installed your Maxwell plugin, the maxwell.rb, which is a Ruby script file, and the Maxwell folder. We're going to go ahead and navigate into the Maxwell folder. And we're going to look for a folder called RES, and RES is our resources folder. If you do not have the full Maxwell render suite installed, and you probably don't, then you're going to need these resources folders. We have an IOR folder, we have an MXM folder, preview folder, Simulens folder, and Sky folder. And all of these files are going to be very, very important to us while we're working within this training series. So let me just go ahead and hold down Shift and click that X to clear everything out. And we're going to go ahead and load up SketchUp 8. Now, if you don't have SketchUp 8, you might not be seeing the same things that I'm seeing, but if you do, I'd like you to go ahead and set your toolbars the same way that I have mine so that we're all seeing the same things. So we're going to go to View, Toolbars. I'm using the Large toolset instead of the Getting Started toolset. I've also got the Layers open, the Shadows open, and of course I've got the Maxwell open. I've also am using large buttons. You don't have to use large buttons if you don't want to, but I wanted you to see what I was clicking on, so that's the reason why I have that. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the user interface in this video. To begin with, let's go ahead and click on the Fire button, and that's going to enable us to see the Maxwell Fire render window. Now, this is a fairly simple window. It doesn't have a lot of options to it, at least at first. So the first option here is to enable Fire. Basically what this does is it sends whatever we have in our SketchUp scene to Fire, and then it begins to render. And at that point, it will continue to render every time we make a change until we tell it to stop by simply closing this window and clicking the X. We can change the settings of that render engine by clicking this little gear icon, which is for settings. Something that's really important to understand is that what you can change within this dialog will be dependent upon which version of the Maxwell for SketchUp plugin you have. If you have the free version, then you're only going to be able to set the resolution up to 800 pixels, and you're only going to be able to use the draft engine. So basically the settings that you see here are going to be pretty much close to your limits. However, if you have the paid version of this plugin, then you're going to have a higher limit for your maximum resolution, and you're going to be able to choose the production engine. So let me just go ahead and talk about what these settings mean, and then this will become more clear to you in a second. This first icon here is sample level, and what's next to that is a slider bar. Basically, the way that the slider bar works is that you simply click and drag, and it makes a slider that you can move around whichever way you want. If you want to manually enter in a value, just click on the text and type in whatever you'd like. However, you're going to need to accept that value. In order to accept the value, you just need to go ahead and click someplace else in the user interface. In this case, I clicked on the threads value, and you can see that the slider is now where it needs to be. So what is this sample level, the SL? Well, basically the idea within Maxwell is pretty straightforward. It's the number of bounces that the light is going to be having. The higher the number of bounces, the more quality we're going to have in our final render, the more detail, and the more refined everything's going to be, the less noise. So generally speaking, when you're trying to render out a finished product, a higher sample level is better. However, when we're working within SketchUp and we're working on a scene and we want to get instant feedback, which we'll be doing quite often, we're going to want to keep a lower sample level so that we're not constantly rendering to very, very high sample levels. Below that, we have threads. And the idea with threads is basically that we can control the number of processors that this engine is accessing at any given time. If you set it at 0, it will automatically determine what it can use and what it can't use, meaning how many ever cores you have available on your system is what it will use. However, the idea being is that if you want to set it manually for a particular number of cores, you can set that right here by adjusting that slider. Below that, we have max res. Well, max res is the maximum resolution. When you're working within the SketchUp scene and you're making changes and you want to get quick feedback, a lower maximum resolution is going to give you faster feedback, and things are just going to happen much, much quicker. However, when you're rendering out your finished product, you're probably going to want to go to a higher maximum resolution. Now, the way that the maximum resolution works is it basically takes whatever aspect ratio is for our camera, and the long side becomes that maximum resolution. So in this instance, the long side, which would be our horizontal, is going to be 320 pixels in the render. Now this also determines the size of the render when we save it out. How is the short side calculated? Well, basically it just keeps the aspect ratio, so you won't know exactly how many pixels the short side is. It only is concerned about the long side. Like I say, you can max this out at 800 pixels if you're using the free version of the plugin, which is still very useful. However, you can go much higher than that if you're using the paid version. The engine is by default set to draft, and this is what you're going to want to use more often than not when you're looking for previews of the scene as you're working. Now, the output of this can be just as good as the production engine, it just may take longer when it gets to the higher sample levels. If we go to the production engine, it's not going to be as fast as the lower sample levels, which means it's not going to be as good for previewing scenes. However, it's going to yield a more refined finished product, and it's going to generally be just as fast, if not faster, than the draft engine when we start to get into the higher sample levels. Now, how high of a sample level should we be thinking? Well, generally speaking, when I'm doing a finished rendering, I might go somewhere around, say, 25. That might be something I might have to render overnight, depending upon the size of the resolution and how many threads you have. So those are some things that you might want to be conscious of, is that at this stage of the game, where we're still working on setting up a scene, keep these settings fairly low. When you're ready to do your final render, up the settings until you get the quality you're looking for. One of the things that you might notice is that when I click on something, if I don't want to select something, I'm just clicking off in this light gray area. Basically what that's doing is allowing me to select dead area. It's a click that goes nowhere. So if you ever get to a place where you're clicking on something and you don't want to select something, or you want to just click off of a value that you have, just click in the light gray area, and that's sort of dead space within this plugin. These little buttons that you see next to it will allow you to reset the values back to their default state. So if you ever get to some place where you're like, oh, gee, I have it someplace and I don't remember what the reset was, so just hit reset like so, and it will reset it back to the default. In this instance, a sample level of 2 isn't going to do us much good, so I'm just going to go ahead and set it for 10 and make sure that we have our threads probably set back to 0, and so on and so forth. So I'm done with this. I'm not going to worry about that anymore. We're not going to need this window immediately, so I'm just going to go ahead and close that just to free up a little bit of screen real estate. The next 3 icons here are all going to be relevant to MXM files. And MXM files are specific Maxwell material files. Now, we're not going to be able to necessarily make MXM files within this plugin. However, we can access MXM files that we've gotten through other resources. One of the best resources is Maxwell's website. They have well over 3,000 or 4,000 materials that you can download for free. And of course, that can be very useful. And we'll come back and cover these 3 buttons when we're looking at materials. These final 3 buttons are going to be all about information. So the first one is the plugin manual, which means the Maxwell to SketchUp plugin manual. Now, the idea with that plugin manual is that basically it's only going to cover the things that are relevant to the plugin. The next icon is our Maxwell manual. And what that basically means is that we're going to be getting the full information of the entire Maxwell render suite. Now, some of that information isn't relevant if you don't own the suite. However, there's a lot of really fundamental basic information that you're going to find some value in if you read the Maxwell manual. And of course, the plugin manual will often refer you back to the Maxwell manual if it's a topic that's outside of the scope of just the plugin specific information. The final icon here is actually information about this plugin. So it's going to go ahead and open up a dialog, and it's going to spit out the version number and that kind of information that lets you know what's going on with this plugin. So really, the main icons that we're going to be working with 9 times out of 10 while we're working are these 4 right here. And the most important of the 4 is this pencil icon, which is our Maxwell Scene Manager. Now, of course, the interface is very similar to the Fire render window. You can see here we have our light gray dead space, we have our sliders, we have our values. Everything works pretty much the same way. However, here we also have tabs. So the first tab is for materials, the second tab is for camera, the third tab is for environment, the fourth tab is for output, and the fifth tab is for options. So when you're looking at these, you of course want to be thinking to yourself, okay, what tab do I want to be in to do exactly what it is that I want to do? Within each tab, you're going to find these little subheadings that will allow you to flip the arrow open and deal with those settings and then close that back up. And this way we can have a lot of information where it would be problematic for us to have all this open because we might have to scroll up and down in order to see all these. We can simply collapse them like so, and be able to work with a very small user interface, which is very handy. You'll also find at the top 3 sets of buttons on some of these: the undo, the redo, and the advanced view. So the advanced view basically is going to reveal to us things that we can't see in the basic view. So right now in the basic view, we only have one subheading, which is export. If we go to the advanced view, you can see we also have materials, tone mapping, and simulants. And again, we're getting into an area here where we have a lot of stuff that's going right off the edge, so we're having to scroll up and down. The reason why you might want to use the basic view at first is because it gives you the settings that are most relevant to working with the plugin. The advanced view is for people who want to get down into the nitty-gritty and take full advantage of the render engine. And of course, the longer you work with it, the more likely it is that you're going to want to get into those advanced views. So I'm going to tend to have those open by default. And so if you look in a tab and you see that I've got all these extra subheadings, the reason why is because I've got the advanced view going, and I just like to work that way more often than not, because generally speaking, I'm a power user of Maxwell, and that means that I'm going to want to take full advantage of what Maxwell offers to me. Now, you'll also see that we have the ability sometimes of making presets. Right now, I don't have a preset here, but if I wanted to make one, I could take whatever settings that I have within this tab, and I could go ahead and just click that plus button, and it would make a preset for me. And of course, we would always have access to that preset at any given time by simply clicking on this drop-down and choosing from that preset. A good example of these drop-down lists is over here in the materials. So if I come over here and I just click this little gray bar, you can see that this is a drop-down. By clicking something like, say, Jean Blue, I can now work with that Jean Blue material. The Jean Blue material would be what she's wearing on her pants. So I can come in here and I can begin to work with the materials using the material-specific interface by simply clicking that first drop-down item and picking whichever material I want to work with. Now, in addition to that, we also have the ability to switch into MXM mode. Now, when we have some MXMs, then this will become more apparent to us, but remember that the user interface can flip between the MXM mode and our basic sort of character mode. Now, what do I mean when I say character? Well, you can see that these materials here have a character type. By default, it has the automatic type, but we also have plastic, lacquer, car paint, metal, liquid, glass, AGS, which is architectural glass solution, SSS, which is subsurface scattering, SSS single-sided, satin, velvet, complex IOR, remember those IOR files that I showed you in the resources folder? Emitters, and HDR image. So we have a lot of character types that we can choose from. So in this instance, maybe I want to go to type, and maybe I'll choose something like a velvet character. So I don't have a lot of options for velvet. However, if I do a quick little preview render of that, you can see that I've got a blue velvet. It's basically taking that color and it's filtering it through the character type of velvet. If I wanted to try, say, satin, which wouldn't be very good for pants, but let's go ahead and take a look, you can see that now I have a satin character for her pants. Now, if we come over here to environment, you'll find that we also have a drop-down list. And in this drop-down list, we have sky dome, physical sky, image-based, and none. These are all determining the environments. But the bottom line here is that by default, the way that this plugin is going to work is that it's going to pull the information from the SketchUp end of things, and it's going to try its best to manipulate that information without changing what we're seeing in the SketchUp viewport. However, one of the ways that that will change is as soon as we change our type from sky dome to physical sky, image base, or none, because immediately the other three are going to have to disregard what we have going on in our SketchUp style. The sky dome is unique in the sense that if we come up to Window, we come over to Styles, and we come over to Edit, and we come to the third button here, which is our background, it's going to pull its information for our sky dome based on the sky color. It's also going to pull our ground plane information. If we have ground plane set to application, it's also going to get that information from either the ground or the background here of whatever we have going on in the style. So as far as the basic settings of this environment, it's going to pull that primarily from the style. However, if we come over here and we choose something like, say, physical sky, all of a sudden we're dealing with something that is not going to be represented in our SketchUp style, and these settings are more or less going to be ignored, except in this case, the ground plane is set to application, which is still going to get that green ground plane. So to see that in action, I'm going to go ahead and turn on the sun. And one thing that you have to know about the sun is that it's going to get its settings from our shadow sliders up here. So these shadow sliders, meaning the time of year and the time of day, are going to ultimately determine where the sun is. And this button here is going to determine whether or not the sun is on or off. The reason why I say that is because if we turn on shadows, that does not necessarily turn on or off the sun over here. So you generally want to have this on and this not on, because ultimately this slows down SketchUp, whereas this works for Maxwell. So it's actually beneficial to not have to worry about having your shadows on in order to be able to see what's going on in Maxwell. So let's just come over here to Fire, go ahead and enable the engine, and you can see immediately that we've got a physical sky, we've got our sun, we've got shadows, and basically we've got a ground plane that's green that's sort of matching this. So let's just go ahead, move this down a bit, come over here and start messing with the time of year and the time of day. So you can see immediately how quickly that's making whatever changes we need in order to see our shadow settings. So we don't really need to have shadows on in SketchUp, and that's going to really save you a lot of time while you're working in SketchUp. Now we can have our camera anywhere we want to within SketchUp, and as soon as we stop moving, you'll see that that information gets fed right back into the Fire engine. So we can work within SketchUp just like we always would. However, we're going to be seeing a real-time preview with the Fire engine of the work that we're doing as soon as we're done doing it. So this is a really nice user interface. And we're going to cover all of these things. We're going to cover the materials, the camera settings, and the environment in great, great detail, because ultimately that's going to be the thing that really determines the results that you're going to be getting from this workflow. However, like I said, this first one was basically all about just the basic user interface.